Okay, I'm going to start the webinar. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Kabir, and I'm with Battlelever Research Group. I will be your host today for today's session. We got an amazing speaker joining us today, and she will be talking about market access and crop protection decisions for 2026 season. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to thank all the counties that fund and support our work. Because of their support, we are able to offer webinars like these and we bring valuable information out to our producer. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the presentation, please hold them until the end of the session. We will have a short Q&A session. And if something urgent comes up or you need my help during the webinar, feel free to drop a message in the chat. I will be keeping an eye on it throughout the session. It's my pleasure to introduce Krista Zuzak. She's a director of crop protection and production at Cereals Canada, where she works to protect and expand market access for Canadian cereal producers. Krista leads efforts to address crop protection and trade issues and help safeguard the global competitiveness of Canadian cereals through initiatives such as Keep It Clean program. Over to you, Krista.
Thanks so much, Kabir, and good morning, everyone online. As he mentioned, my name is Krista Zuzak, and I'm really pleased to join you all online today to talk about market access in cereals and what we're looking at going into the 2026 growing season. So with that, maybe if you're not familiar with Cereals Canada, we are the National Not-for-Profit Industry Association representing the Canadian cereals value chain. So that includes wheat, durum wheat, barley, and oats. And maybe just for a bit more context on us, we have both a technical side that focuses on how to use Canadian wheat in milling and baking and other uses like noodles and pasta. And then we also have an area that's focused on market access, and that's part of the team that I'm on. So my role really focuses more on the primary production side of things like pesticides, contaminants like heavy metals and mycotoxins, pesticide residues and pest management, as well as biotechnology in cereals. And so really a lot of the focus is on what these mean for our export markets and our customers of Canadian wheat, barley, and oats. Also worth mentioning, I know we're with an Alberta-based organization here. So Cereals Canada is based in Winnipeg, but I work remotely just west of Edmonton in Alberta. So when we think about market access, a big part of what we do on monitoring and helping stay compliant with export market requirements has to do with maximum residue limits. And these are really around pesticides, and I'll be referring to them as MRLs. And one of the reasons that this is so important and that I mentioned export market requirements is just because of the sheer volume that we export. So more than 80% of our Canadian grown cereals are exported. So it's really important that we're able to, think about those requirements in those markets. And a big part of that and a big part of my role is around MRLs and what I want to share with you today. So what is an MRL? An MRL it's the highest amount of pesticide residue that's expected to remain on a food product like harvested grain, for example, when that product or that pesticide is used correctly, really focusing on it being used according to its label. And the way that they establish this value for an MRL, it's based on toxicology concepts like, which levels don't cause adverse effects, as well as an acceptable daily intake. So thinking about, how much of that food that you would be eating or how much grain you would be consuming. And really, these numbers are already hundreds of times below anything that would pose a risk. So you'll see on your screen on the right side, there's kind of that margin of safety. We look at that no observed adverse effect level. So where we don't see, negative effects in test animals, we also think about that acceptable daily intake, and then that bottom darker green bar at the bottom, that's where we set MRLs for pesticides. So in most cases, as I mentioned, MRLs might be set, 100 times or more below anything that could affect human health. So we often hear that, MRLs equal food safety, or that, pesticide use is somehow, unsafe or related to food safety. But when we look at the MRL specifically, this is not a measure of food safety. Really, MRLs are there to show that the product was applied properly, and it helps ensure predictable, stable market access through predictable residues being produced. Different countries also have different agencies that set MRLs in their markets, but in Canada, it's Health Canada that sets our MRLs through the PRD, or the Pesticide Regulatory Directorate, which you may formerly know as the PMRA. But as exporters, Canadian crops need to meet those MRLs that are set by other countries that we export to, and that's where things can start to get complicated. So for MRLs to help with trade predictability, it also helps when other countries have established MRLs for the same active ingredients or pesticide, or they might have deferral pathways where they use another country's MRLs, or they might set import tolerances. Some countries also defer to Codex, which is an international standard setting body for MRLs, so that those countries are able to use kind of globally accepted risk assessments that Codex does. So where we run into issues is where we don't have a pathway for missing or misaligned MRLs. So essentially, the amount of residues that we allow are not aligned between Canada and another country, for example, or when we have one country that has a much lower MRL than another. This can cause trade issues such as non-compliance notifications, or even shipment rejections if it's serious enough and if we have residues present. I also mentioned an import tolerance. So, this is when an active ingredient or a pesticide is not registered in another country, but imported grains coming from Canada, for example, are treated with that active. So what we see there is the importing country may not have an MRL for their country, but they will establish an import tolerance. So it acts in the same way and it covers us. This way, Canada can still use the registered product to control pests in our crops, and the importing country can source the quality grain they're looking for. And as well on the screen, I did list just a few of kind of the MRL policies that we see in export markets that we need to think about when we're doing a lot of this monitoring and assessment work. So in Canada, for example, we do have a national MRL list. We don't defer to another country's MRLs, and we have a default MRL in place of 0.1 parts per million. So also when you see other countries like the United States, they might not have a default MRL, or the European Union as a bloc applies a default MRL of 0.01 parts per million. It also gives you an idea of really how small these amounts of pesticide residues that are remaining are. So if we can test and detect or set limits at 0.01 parts per million, these limits are very, very small in a lot of cases. So again, furthering that these are not related to health concerns and really just there for trade. And then we do have other countries, like I mentioned, that they might defer to Codex, or they might defer to another country. So these are all important parts for us at Cereals Canada to understand internally, and to be able to have these conversations with you, which we'll get to about how we can meet these requirements. So another important consideration is not only that we have residues that are produced by pesticides, but also the testing for these residues. So in Canada, we have a multimodal agricultural supply chain. So there are many points where grain is tested before it leaves Canada, and also at the export destination for compliance with those domestic and also those export limits. And this is also really important to keep in mind for the tips and also the products that we're discussing today, so that we can stay compliant. And it's also something we've seen changing and evolving over time, that over the years, there is more testing happening, and testing has also become more sensitive. So we're able to test in labs to lower limits for these pesticide residues. So why can MRL compliance be complicated? I think first, one of the most important ones for growers like yourselves would be that pesticide labels don't list MRLs. So products may be fully registered in Canada for use, but information about these international markets and that risk doesn't necessarily appear on the label. And globally, as I mentioned, regulations are shifting quickly. So we do see more importing countries expanding residue testing, which means, unfortunately, more opportunities for minor harmless residues to become trade barriers. So, for example, France recently proposed a decree to restrict residues of several banned pesticides from entering the country through imported food. So, what this would mean for Canadian growers is potential risks around the use of those pesticides that, although they might be registered for use here in Canada, if they are considered banned in, somewhere that we export to, like the European Union, that could also cause some compliance issues. But to get back to it, I'm not suggesting labeling is the answer with changing MRLs and markets for your grain, but there are some measures you can take that I want to share with you today. So what can you do on the farm? First and foremost, it would be follow the label. So follow your pesticide label, your rate, your timing, and your pre-harvest interval. This really remains the foundation of residue predictability and also compliance. So for example, later season applied products often are more likely to produce residues than an early season, or you think about like a pre-burn down application. And the same kind of considerations maybe would be for your crop type and how it's shipped. So, we might see more risk for containerized shipments like barley rather than bulk handled crops like wheat, where residues are more likely to be diluted. And then finally, I would say, when we're thinking about kind of this changing international landscape and where we do see countries changing their legislation, changing their policies, increasing testing, that all adds to that complexity of trade. It's really about those connections that we have. So staying connected with your commodity associations. So, whether that be your more regional local ones, so like Alberta Grains, for example, or the Prairie Oak Growers Association, or it might be your national commodity association like Cereals Canada for cereals, but also your grain buyer. So we kind of serve as a bit of your early warning system for evolving trade and residue risk. And your grain buyer ultimately has the best idea of the markets that they're shipping to and where your grain might be going. So part of how we communicate all of this is through our Keep It Clean program. Keep It Clean is really here to support growers with timely, practical information on these market access issues in crops, like what we've started to talk about today. And Keep It Clean functions as a partnership. So it was started by Canola Council Canada, and now it also includes Pulse Canada, us here at Cereals Canada, and also the Prairie Oak Growers Association. So you can check out our resources online that I'm going to walk you through today. Especially, I think our product advisory is one of our most important. And we do have some crop specific guidance for cereals as well. And later in my presentation, I will put up a QR code that you're able to scan and access, or you can also look online at keepitclean.ca. And really, this communication platform is here as part of our job to help ensure that Canadian crops meet our customer requirements, and producers are really key partners in this initiative. So now that you understand MRLs and maybe I've scared you a little bit about them, what can we do? So we kind of have these, we call them our 5 tips as part of Keep It Clean that I'm going to touch on each briefly, including some highlights for the 2026 growing season that will be important. So our first tip is around using acceptable pesticides only. So this relates back to the fact that we might have pesticides that are registered for use in Canada, for example, but some of them can still cause trade concerns. And I'm going to go into more detail about how that can happen. But really, it's being aware of where there might be market risks. And again, one of those best pieces of advice I can give you is, to talk to your grain buyer ahead of the growing season or before you apply crop protection or pesticide products to ensure that those products you're planning to use are acceptable to both domestic and export customers. And again, keeping in mind, sometimes the timing plays a factor. So especially those later season products, some of those can cause market risk. So you want to be sure that you're covered there. And again, with Canada being so export dependent, it does already introduce a lot of market risks, and as well as with the number of markets that we ship to. So to address this, there has been a policy that was developed by the Canada Grains Council. So if you're not familiar, Canada Grains Council is an umbrella organization that represents Canadian grain, oilseed, pulse, and special crop sectors. So Cereals Canada is a member of Canada Grains Council, and we work together. So they developed this policy to try to be proactive in addressing these risks so that, we balance farmers having access to new tools, new pesticides, new technology, but also we balance that with not putting market access at risk if we might have, for example, missing or misaligned MRLs. So when we look to this, we don't want pesticides to become another non-tariff trade barrier in agriculture, which we do see growing as a trend. So, when we turn on the news or we read online and we see, for example, proposed bans on glyphosate in other countries, this really emphasizes that importance of science-based decision-making and policy. So this policy was also developed in collaboration with grower associations, our national commodity associations, grain companies, life science companies, and also our members from the Canadian Association of Ag Retailers. So it is a voluntary policy that our national commodity organizations form a committee on to assess risk. So we have a cereals committee, for example, that covers wheat, barley, and oats. Here at Cereals Canada, we conduct annual assessments on crop protection products and crop use patterns as well that have a new or an amended registration to be able to evaluate that risk of trade disruption through our committee. So we have a full value chain representation. So really, I like to think of it like we have everyone at the table. So, we have our registrants that are providing input and data that have their chemistry kind of under review. But we also have grower representatives from our grower groups to provide that, boots on the ground information or, to be able to voice those challenges that they might see in the field or, where they see a need for these tools. We also have our ag retailers that would be doing a lot of the selling and marketing of these products, as well as our grain handlers and shippers, because again, they're taking on a lot of this liability or a lot of this risk of shipping product that's treated with these pesticides. And so this all kind of works together, sitting down at one table to have a conversation around what those residues look like and other factors to be able to move on and to assess what that risk level looks like. So how do we do that? From here, we think about the largest markets we ship grain to. We review pesticides, again, focusing on new actives on the market, as well as where we might see changes to MRLs and policies. And then we want to think about, what does that risk look like or how close can that call be? So when we think about markets of interest, what does that mean? We really break it down into major markets based on some criteria. So kind of the biggest and easiest ones would be market share. So our major export destinations, so markets that average more than 5% of our exports over the last 3 years, or those that meet a certain dollars of export cutoff. But we also have some other ones that are kind of interesting to think about. So we have those that are considered, standard setters or policy leaders. So these are ones that would be more influential. So I talked about Codex as being an international standard using risk assessments. So countries that defer to Codex, it's important that we look at, what the Codex MRL looks like. Also the US, the European Union. So we do have a lot of other countries that adopt EU or European Union MRLs. And then we also have some that are maybe undergoing policy change. So this is also part of the monitoring work we do to understand what their policies are like, or what's happening in those markets. So those that are maybe making changes to their policies or establishing new MRLs. So this would include like South Korea and China, for example, where maybe they're undergoing some reform in their policies. So other factors outside of only residues are also considered. So it's not purely a data exercise. So these criteria, they also include the importance of actives to control priority pests like Fusarium head blight, which produces mycotoxins. And like I said, this policy is really there to strive to, reach that balance between innovation and market access, which can be challenging. So we do also make other deliberations, such as shipping in containers, which I mentioned can concentrate residues versus, bulk handling in something like wheat. But we also do some digging into some, of the destination or end use considerations, like around, what their regulatory system is like, or, perhaps if there are other mitigation measures to think about. So finally, after all of these points are covered, the active or the product reaches the stage of categorization where, this is where we're starting to work up to being able to communicate it out to growers. So this categorization provides additional clarity for our growers and our agronomists that are using or recommending this product, as well as predictability for trade. So these categorizations, as you see on your screen, they function a bit like a traffic light. So green is where we see no risks identified, while red is on the opposite end of the spectrum where risks for trade disruption have been identified and growers are advised not to use this active on either a particular crop or a specific use pattern. There's also this yellow or amber category, which is referred to as be informed, where there may be some risks identified, whether for a particular market or a particular use. And this is, again, where growers are encouraged to communicate with their grain buyer in advance of using this product on their crops, because it may be something that is okay to use if your buyer isn't shipping to that market, but it's something that also could potentially be problematic at times. So where this ends up going is onto our product advisory on Keep It Clean. So this was our 2025 product advisory. And so we did have some products on there for cereals, and it breaks it down, but we also strive to include a bit of a rationale for advisories in place, whether they be for fungicides, herbicides, or other pesticides. So there's also an understanding of why there is advice not to use this active. And then when we look at our 2026 Keep It Clean product advisory, I do want to highlight that we have made an update for 2026. And the update I really want to highlight today would be on fluopyram, which commercially Prosaro Pro has been removed from the product advisory for 2026 on barley. And this is something that was previously a red or a do not use. So this is a positive signal that I'm going to talk through with you today. And it's also the first time in cereals that we have had an advisory that we are able to remove because of the work that's been done. So maybe for a bit of a history on fluopyram, it's been our Keep It Clean advisory since 2022 due to missing or misaligned MRLs in some of our key export markets. So because of this, growers were advised to avoid using it on malt barley and talk to their grain buyers before they were using it on barley for food or feed, which again can sometimes even be complicated there. If you're hoping to make malt and you don't necessarily, and it goes for food or feed, these are difficult decisions for growers to make, and also something difficult to try to communicate as clearly as possible what this guidance looks like. Earlier, I did highlight the importance of looking at markets of interest. So, for barley, for example, we look at the major export markets for both food and feed barley as well as malt. And we also assess how these markets may change over time in terms of export volumes. So you'll see at the bottom of the screen, I just put up the MRLs. Those are in parts per million for information. But primarily when we're looking at barley, a lot of what we're looking at is that Canadian MRL, Codex, South Korea, the United States, Japan, and China are some of our biggest markets for barley. And so what we've seen here is over the past few years, so since 2022, additional MRLs in our export markets were established. So the missing Japan MRL was established in February 2025, which aligned with Codex. And then from here, actually, since we started to plan this webinar, we're pleased to share that the last key market that didn't have an aligned MRL, which was South Korea, has recently set an MRL for fluopyromet barley at 0.4 parts per million. So again, also aligned with Codex. So now you can see how it looks when we have nicely aligned MRLs in major export markets, which is it's a good measure for us of trade continuity. So it's an exciting time for us for the 2026 growing season now that we have MRLs in place across these key markets. That fluopyram can be used on barley for the 2026 growing season without restrictions. And so what that means in practicality, other than that, there are no restrictions to using the product, we've also removed that barley advisory from our Keep It Clean website and our communications. And further to that is also on the declaration side of things. So up until this year, the producer declarations that you would be signing would include essentially a line that, fluopyram was not applied on barley. That also will be removed. So there won't be those kind of restrictions in place or that additional complication that you have to think, when you're applying products or when you're getting ready to deliver grain to the elevator. And further to that, I also want to briefly highlight our other advisories that are maintained on Keep It Clean as we go into the growing season as a good reminder. So again, we'll continue with malt barley to start. So starting with the fungicide, tetraconazole. So currently grain buyers will not accept malt barley that is treated with tetraconazole, and this is due to MRL marketing risks that are identified in some key export markets. So in this case, we do have MRLs missing for Codex as well as in China. And further on the malt barley side of things, chlormequat does continue to pose a potential market access risk on barley due to MRL misalignments in some export countries. Chlormequat has been categorized as that yellow or amber, so the be informed, with misaligned MRLs in China, Codex, and the US. Although, again, as a bit of an update, I am happy to share that the Codex MRL was previously 2 parts per million, but as of December 2025, it is up to 5 parts per million. So, it is important to consult with your grain buyer before using this product on barley, whether it's for malt or food or feed, as a consideration, as there are still some missing MRLs. The other one I want to flag is saflufenicil. So there is a continued potential marketing risk for malt barley that's treated with saflufenicil or heat. But this is actually due to negative effects on the malting process, which is interesting. So it is acceptable on food and feed barley, which we'll go over. But to be clear, as you can see as our MRLs on the screen, this isn't an MRL related issue, but it is related to acceptance by malt companies. So we also want to use Keep It Clean to be able to share that message. So now to continue with barley for food and feed, we've gone over tetraconazole and chlormequat. So again, that potential MRL related marketing risk for barley treated with chlormequat, the same as for malt barley. And as I mentioned, since our last update, there has been that change to the Codex MRL, which is promising. So this is especially true where we have multiple MRLs that are low or missing. This is the kind of stepwise progress that is, moving us in the direction of being able to hopefully remove this advisory soon if we would see a little bit more progress. And again, opens up another tool for growers to be able to use without some of those considerations for market access. And finally, we'll cover glyphosate on cereals as well, but altogether on cereals, as there are no changes, and this is a standing category. So on malt barley, It is a red or a do not use, as malt buyers will not accept grain that is treated with pre-harvest glyphosate. And for other cereals, so barley, wheat, and oats, it's important to check with your grain buyer if they do have any restrictions in place on the use of pre-harvest glyphosate in markets that they ship to. So glyphosate is also related to market acceptance and not the MRLs themselves. So we do have established MRLs for glyphosate in our export markets, and we do meet those domestic and export market needs. So from here, now that we've talked about the product advisory, a lot of the product watchouts for 2026, but continuing with our Keep It Clean tips, I think I've mentioned follow the label a few times during this webinar, but really that's one of our major tips is, keeping in mind your pesticide label for your rate, your timing, and your pre-harvest interval, really to avoid unacceptable or unpredictable product residues. So really, keeping in mind, especially something like your PHI that can be problematic if we're, cutting that short, for example. I also want to highlight another tool that we do have on the Keep It Clean site, and it falls under our Follow the Label campaign, and it's our pre-harvest glyphosate staging guide. So we have this tool, it's a visual guide, and really it's there to provide information that helps reduce that risk of unacceptable residues. Glyphosate is sort of an interesting one because it is a systemic herbicide, so meaning that it's absorbed by the plant and translocated through its tissues. So actually the opposite of what you would think. So when glyphosate is applied too early and the plant is still actively growing and grain filling is ongoing, the glyphosate can be more rapidly absorbed and it can be distributed to that developing grain. So if it's applied closer to harvest when the plant is nearing maturity and grain moisture is actually lower, we see less glyphosate being absorbed and it's actually less likely to accumulate in the grain. So even though we say, watch your pre-harvest interval and that you don't want to cut it too close because then there could be problematic residues, glyphosate actually functions kind of in the opposite way. So again, really the importance of, reading and following that label for compliance. Also part of follow the label that I think is important to highlight for the 2026 growing season would be desiccants. So I think for desiccants, it's especially also important to be following the label. Part of this also has to do with, again, that later application timing that I flagged earlier, and what that might look like if we're applying a product this late in the season. The chances of residues really are increased. So when we're thinking about cereals specifically, when we have desiccants like glufosinate ammonium and diquat, which are not registered for use on cereals, we can see market access issues if these are used. So although they will function as a desiccant on your cereals, they're not a registered use. And this is not only important from just the residue perspective, but also because of MRLs. So because it's not a registered use, we often don't have MRLs that are available in these markets. So as you can see on your screen, we don't have a Codex MRL, we don't have a US MRL, we don't have an MRL in China. So if these products were to be used in Canada and this grain is exported and tested for, this could be something very problematic for our market access. So it's especially important to follow the label and really stick to using registered desiccants on your cereals. To kind of move the other way a little bit, also thinking about disease pressures. So when we think about kind of BMPs that are out there, largely well known by growers, we're thinking about, disease-resistant varieties where possible, thinking about things like crop rotation, the seed that you're using, and really, digging into that integrated pest management approach that you might be using to try to use all the tools in your toolbox to manage those diseases. And one of the parts of that and how it ties into Keep It Clean is, again, that market access angle. And Fusarium is a really good example. Not only is it an important disease in cereals that we promote the management of, but it can cause yield issues. It can also cause market access issues. So it might be a little small on your screen, But as you can see, fusarium damaged kernels also function as a downgrading factor for your grain. So that's not something that we want to see. But maybe one of the parts that's less known is from a market access point of view, countries can and do set maximum levels, so similar to a maximum residue limit, a maximum level for deoxynivalenol or DON, the mycotoxin that's produced by the fungal fusarium species. So on Keep It Clean, we have our BMPs, but we also try to promote other resources. So for example, links to tools like the Fusarium risk maps, which can help growers make those timely spray decisions in years where Fusarium risk is higher. These use weather data. So since Fusarium prefers kind of those warmer, wet years, and that flowering period is so crucial for infection, and therefore the timing that you're controlling this disease, having additional tools like these Fusarium risk maps can provide that live data to growers to be able to make those decisions where they need to. So I also want to talk to you a little bit about ergot. So another important disease to manage in your cereals. And there's also a bit of lore around ergot historically. So with ergot, during the 1600 Salem witch trials, there is a real theory that suggests that, bewitchment was actually ergotism. So poisoning caused by the claviceps fungus, which infects cereals. And really, there's a range of susceptibility in your cereals to ergot, but it can really badly infect rye, which was the staple grain of 17th century Salem. So ergot contains and it produces alkaloids as a form of mycotoxin. So these are actually the chemical precursors to LSD. So what we can see is that ingesting contaminated flour that has ergot in it can cause ergotism. So this could cause anything from vivid hallucinations, muscle spasms, the sensation of skin crawling, and these were all symptoms that were kind of reported by the afflicted or the witches of Salem. So records do show that in the spring of 1691, was really unusually warm, and they were having a hot, humid summer. So these also point to really having good conditions that are required for ergot to flourish in their rye fields and subsequently potentially enter the flour and the food supply. So whether you believe or not that, the Salem witch trials may have been related to contaminated grains, ergot does produce those toxic alkaloids that, pose risks both to human and animal health. So even low levels of contamination can lead to downgrading. We can see shipment rejections if it's bad enough, or it can require additional cleaning. So with ergot, we really think of proactive management being key. And if this effective management, it's not only crucial for the safety of our grains and producing the high quality grain that we're known for, but also ensuring access to domestic and international markets. So like Fusarium, some export markets for Canadian cereals have established maximum levels for ergot sclerotia, which are those little bodies that replace the grain that you see on the screen, or the ergot alkaloids in the grain that are produced by those. So ergot is also a good point for why limits exist for so many compounds, even for those that are naturally occurring, not just pesticides. And we're going to move on to kind of the storage side of things as we work through our tips. So another one of our tips is on store your crop properly. This one also relates to disease a bit, but when we're thinking about, bin storage, we want to have our bins cleaned out before storage. We want to think about bin treatments, even, keeping bins cool, dry, well ventilated, and checking on their condition can help prevent a lot of these problems. Another one that I want to highlight here too is also for allergens. So when we think about different grains being stored in bins or transported, part of that also has to do with the commingling or cross-contamination of grain. So we can have, certain grains like mustards or soy or even buckwheat that can be allergens in export markets. So in important markets like Japan, for example, buckwheat can be a very serious allergen for consumers. So I would say it's something akin to a peanut allergy in North America. So that's something that, again, kind of at our point of origin, we want to be managing as best as possible when we're storing or moving our crops. But to go along with that, thinking about kind of the bin condition part of things, part of this has to do with ochratoxin A. So ochratoxin A, or OTA, is also a mycotoxin, so similar to deoxynivalenol or DON that's produced by Fusarium, but it forms exclusively in storage rather than in the field. So like DON from Fusarium, countries can also set maximum levels for OTA. So managing this disease does help keep markets open. And for this one, it's small on your screen, but I also noted just how low the maximum levels are set at for OTA. And this is due to how toxic this mycotoxin can be in small doses. Just for an idea, like 0.005 parts per million are what some of these regulations are set at, for example. So our final tip on Keep It Clean is about deliver what you declare. So that reminder that, the declaration of eligibility affidavit that's signed at the elevator is a legally binding document. And that there are, traceability and consequences to that document, as well as, liabilities if there would be the contamination of a bin or a shipment. And maybe just to bring it back to our product advisory, this is also where, when you're signing your documents at the elevator, there might be specifics around crop protection products that are, not to be used or that are essentially restricted because of some of the marketing issues that we've identified today. So with that, I did tell you I'd post our QR code, so you can visit keepitclean.ca for more information or anything more about what I've talked about today on our program, as well as the QR code on the screen that we do keep updated throughout the growing season, or if there are changes in market requirements or the product advisory, we keep all of those live on our website. And with that, I also want to provide my contact information if you have any further questions, or get in touch with Kabir to get in touch with me as well. I'm very happy to connect on anything or market access in cereals that we've talked about today. And with that, Kabir, I will turn it over back to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much for this amazing presentation. So now we'll open the floor for Q&A. If you have any question, feel free to type it in the Q&A section, or can always type it in the chat section too. Or if you're someone who doesn't like typing, you can always click on raise your hand and I can allow you to talk. Oh, you already have a question. What are the defaults of MRL? Are those the lowest amount allowed? I noticed Europe has 10 times lower value than Canada. Does it mean even if we apply product as per label in Canada, that could be a problem when export that product to European market?
Perfect. Thanks for your question. I think that's a good one that could use a little more attention. So the default for MRLs would be, so in Canada, for example, our default MRL is 0.1 parts per million. So what that means is if a life science company doesn't establish a specific MRL for a product, that is what it defaults to. So if there isn't, data to go along with it, or if there isn't a higher MRL needed, for example, to cover the residues, that would be the default that we have. Versus, you're right, in Europe and some other countries, they have a 0.1 part per million default. So that would just mean that, again, in those markets, if there isn't a set MRL, it would be down to 0.1. This also would go along with some restrictions. So for example, in Europe, if they deregister or ban a pesticide, for example, and revoke the MRL, or we lose the MRL, that means it does go down to 0.01 parts per million. So that is a case where it could be problematic if we have a product that we use in Canada that is no longer being used in the European Union, and it is something that produces residues. That could be problematic. But that is also part of the monitoring work that we do at Cereals Canada, is to understand markets where we might lose an MRL, for example, or they might be using a default MRL. Are we still able to meet that based on the products we have, how we use them, and what the residues look like? So that is a lot of the monitoring work that we do so that we can avoid exactly these kind of scenarios from happening.
Perfect. Hopefully that answers your question. Are there any more questions? Is there anything else you want to add on to the presentation by the time people are typing their question?
Oh, I think I talked plenty about MRLs to them today, so probably
Yeah.
nothing further to add. But also, if you do think of any questions after the presentation, or if you have questions about specific actives, do feel free to get in touch with us because it is a routine part of our monitoring work.
Okay. Yeah, I don't see any more questions. I guess we'll wait another minute or so. And if you have, Krista, if you have anything else you want to add on till then, and then I guess if there's no more questions, then we can conclude the webinar.
Oh, you know what, Kabir? I did think of one thing to add. Also on our Keep It Clean site, I didn't put up the screenshot, but there is also the ability to sign up for updates. So we do send out newsletters, not a ton of them, but throughout the growing season, we are active about providing updates. So on, Fusarium, on Ergot, and the product advisory is kind of one of our biggest ones that we also have a webinar on. So if you're also interested in keeping up to date on these.
Yeah, I guess there was no more question. Oh, you got stuck for a second. I don't
Oh,
know if it was for everyone, but I couldn't hear anything like for some time, like in the middle when
okay.
you were talking.
Okay, I just mentioned that on our Keep It Clean website, you can also sign up for our newsletter if you're interested.
Perfect. Yeah, I guess your presentation was amazing. Like, no more questions. So I guess we can conclude the webinar and thank you, Krista, again for your time today and sharing this valuable insight. We truly appreciate your contribution and thank you everyone who joined us today. We really appreciate you taking the time to be here. That brings an end to our today's webinar. Hope you found it informative and worthwhile. If you have any feedback or suggestions for future webinars, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're always looking for ideas that are useful to our producers. Thanks again. And if anybody has more questions for Krista, they can always send me an email and I can always forward it to her. Perfect. Thank you, Krista.
Thanks, Kabir. Have
Yeah.
a good rest of your day.
You too.